not going to be able to see my face in this lecture because I'm actually recording this in my office, where I have no access to the usual kind of hardware that I would use for recording these. But I got a good lecture in store for you today, and I would love to talk with you in this last session about the various challenges facing the EU moving forward. We've come a long way this semester. We've talked about theories of integration. We've talked about the institutions of the European Union. In tandem with all of this, you've been reading a series of books that have been very critical of the direction of European integration. Not from a sort of anti-globalist perspective or conservative perspective, as you might sort of think some of the arguments would be, but rather, I think, from a perspective that asks the question about the democratic orientation of the European project and the wisdom of whether or not that project is sort of the wisdom of what seems to have been a decision or determination on the part of the planners, the decision makers, almost from the get-go really, to put certain facets of the European economy, for example, beyond the reach of democratic governance. That is to say, especially, and this is, of course, is Peter Mayer's argument, right? And we'll talk about him in just a minute. To sort of borrow from a phrase Bill Clinton used in the 1990s. Famously, he said, they got no place else to go, right? So this was this idea that Bill Clinton had that, he could basically, because he wasn't a Republican, he could expect that the left, so to speak, would vote for him automatically to keep the Republicans out. But it gave him a free rein to do things that Republicans would never be able to get past, right-wing things, conservative things like NAFTA, for example, or like the crime omnibus bill. So those are sort of things out of American political history in the 1990s, but they're part of the trajectory of what we call neoliberalism and what Peter Mayer has been so critical of. So it's that kind of politics, that neoliberal politics, that has sort of tracked our other conversation this semester, which is the conversation kind of outside of our textbook, but the conversation that's been appearing in our supplementary texts, the Varoufakis, the Mark Blythe, the Peter Mayer, etc., etc. These are all theorists that have, in their different ways, using slightly different languages, all kind of been coming back to this point about whether or not there's a democratic potential in all of this, and what's at stake if we don't heed the panicked voices, the concerned voices of those who want to, protect their interests in all of this. If the left won't provide them with a true democratic option to protect their income, to protect their livelihood, by relentlessly pursuing globalization, if the left won't do that, if the left is sort of co-opted, if you will, by neoliberalism, then the working class has really no choice but to tack to the right. And that's, I think, what Peter Mayer is arguing. Now, in the photograph here, you have Jeremy Corbyn. And I think it's worth taking some time out to think about the hypothesis that Peter Mayer talks about, because, in this class, we're exploring the hypothesis of, well, is Brexit, all of these troubles that the European Union is facing, can they be interpreted as a backlash against the EU? And I think from Peter Mayer's perspective, they could be. In this quote, we see that Mayer is arguing that the age of party democracy is past. Although the parties themselves remain, they have become so disconnected from the wider society and pursue a form of competition that is so lacking in meaning that they no longer seem capable of sustaining democracy in its present form. So Mayer is offering this argument that the parties have kind of become like rival soda companies. You know, can you really tell the difference between a Coke and a Pepsi? Some people say they can, some people say they can't, but there's not really that much of a difference between them, let's face it. Even if there's a slight difference, it's still, you know, we're talking about dancing on the head of a pin here to really actually understand what these differences are. So, in that sense, I think what Mayer is arguing is that democracy has kind of become meaningless. Political parties no longer play the role that they were actually supposed to play. When modern democracy kind of came about, political parties like the British Labour Party, just for example, or the Democrats in the United States, they tried to create a link between the public and the political representatives, right? These are the representatives go to Parliament, the representatives go to Congress, and they're the ones that make the decision makers, that make the decisions rather on our behalf. And of course, it was never a perfect system, but you know, generally they were kind of politicians would work their way up from the ground up, from the bottom up, from the locality up, and they'd know their constituents really well, and they'd have to know their constituents well and have sort of proven to be victorious in achieving goals for them. Now, since the 1990s especially, but beginning in the 70s, you see an inversion of that, that the political party has sort of taken over. The Newt Gingrich revolution, the so-called Gingrich revolution of 1996, I think in the United States was a clear exemplar of this, that the party became more integrated, it became more top-down in nature, and they didn't need money from their membership anymore. I mean, it used to be that the parties, maybe not so much the American parties, but certainly the European parties, always needed money from their base in order to be able to fund themselves and go about their business. But nowadays, membership is no longer really relevant to parties, and so the membership has dwindled because the parties have been able to turn to corporate donors and the money they get from the government in order to be able to achieve their goals. So, yeah, you can see that very, very clearly in the Gingrich Revolution of 1996. And I think as a result of this, the ordinary public has really begun drifting away from parties. They're less likely to vote today. And when they do vote, they are much more likely to shift from party to party, kind of in a confused fashion. You know, we'll go for Democrats this year, Republicans next year. And what the voting masses seem to actually be chasing is an anti-establishment kind of idea, right? And you can see this, of course, clearly with the election in 2016 and the rise of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who are clearly anti-establishment candidates, even though they come from very different political backgrounds and very different ideological perspectives. They definitely were both using anti-establishment rhetoric against the other Republicans and against Hillary Clinton. So what does all of this mean? It means that today the party is no longer really the society's spearhead into the process of government, where society would gain access and a say in the process of government. Today, instead, because the party now comes first and the individual representatives have kind of been relegated and actually sometimes are even parachuted into districts, the age of the old bare-knuckle boxer, the guy that fought his way from the locality level through multiple elections to the state level to the federal level over the course of an entire career, that guy's gone, right? That type of politician doesn't really exist anymore. So instead of representing the people now, and this is Peter Mayer's argument, the party has a new function to legitimize, or if you were cynical about it, to spin what is actually just the technocratic reason of the state to the masses, right? Today the party serves its wealthy donors, its special interests, and as Mark Blythe put it, it follows the ideas of thinkers and academics and intellectuals who create ideas that help maintain the status quo. So in Mayer's work, one of his big case studies is the British Labour Party, which is a party that actually is supposed to be left-wing, right? I mean, it's supposed to be a party that represents the masses, but in the last decades has systematically sought to put limits on the role of ordinary members and unions and maybe even advocacy groups to limit the role of these other actors in influencing the party. In other words, that spearhead idea is being constrained. So there's a famous quote from Gordon Brown, which I think is in the Mayer book, It is for the country to judge, he said. It is not for a few composite motions at a party conference to decide the policy of this government and this country. It is for the whole community, and I'm listening to the whole community. Well, that sounds nice, right? It sounds nice that a leader of a party would be saying, I don't just represent you, I represent the whole community. But in fact, what was going on here was that the party leadership was stepping away from the old role, which was to represent the members. And now that the party members have no say anymore on the party orientation, the question is, well, why would they maintain an interest in politics at all? And of course, so one of the consequences has been that the membership of the parties is declining. And this is, of course, a problem at the EU level as well, because as Peter Mayer makes clear, the purpose of integration was from the start to create what he calls a protected sphere. Protected, that is, from the vagaries and vicissitudes of representative democracy. Because if you're trying to build a single market and it's going to change people's fates in terms of, maybe introducing cheaper foreign competition, that kind of thing, people obviously are going to want to protect their careers. So the economy has to be put beyond democratic debate. And this is, of course, the quintessential trait of neoliberalism. That it says that the market rationality comes first, or the technocratic rationality of the market. The European Union, in that sense, was all about building standards, creating standards, writing standards for trade, for commerce between the different countries, and it was going to be enforced by the European Commission, which is where this idea that we talked about way early on in the semester of the anonymous bureaucrats running the European Union kind of comes from. And I think also in the United States in 2016, you could see a real reaction to this. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, as we said. But in the UK, there has been some equivalent developments. I mean, you have the rise of the British UKIP party on the one hand, which is a conservative right-wing kind of entity that's trying to sort of fight the elites from a right-wing perspective. And of course, on the left, you have the gentleman in the photograph here, who's Jeremy Corbyn, who is unusual insofar as he's ascended to become leader of the British Labour Party, which we were just saying a moment ago under people like Gordon Brown had sort of become more like the US Democrats than anything else. In other words, quite technocratic. Similarly to Bernie Sanders, who's tried to challenge this on the Democratic side, Corbyn is the first actual left-wing politician to make it to a position of political influence in Britain for a very long time. Even within the Labour Party, which is supposed to be a left-wing party, most of the leaders have been quite centrist and technocratic in their attitudes to the economy. Normally, left-wing people want to democratize the economy, right? So under Corbyn, this process of reversal of membership of the Labour Party reversed, right? In fact, quite frankly, it skyrocketed. Upon Corbyn's election, the party, this was back in 2015, upon his election, the 40,000 new Labour Party members joined up in just 5 days. And 1 year later, membership was up by 100,000. So, that's huge for a British political party. Those are massive numbers. So, to take it back to Peter Mayer again, I think both Corbyn, Sanders, and maybe even Trump would be signs that the issue that he's addressing in his book could be reversed. Peter Mayer is dead now, but I mean, I think he might have sort of seen this coming. Now we're a little bit into the Trump administration already, and I think it's clear that Trump's promises to drain the swamp were more hot air, really, than a real commitment. I mean, I think that's becoming quite clear. If you look at Trump's cabinet appointments, there hasn't really been sort of any aggressive action to do some of the things that he was promising to do, like, keep jobs at home, and, there were going to be these sort of economic programs. There was especially, he was promising this kind of like fiscal program to repair the bridges and the roads and things like this, and none of that seems to be happening at all. So nevertheless, Trump, I think, is part of this phenomena that Peter Mayer is talking about. He's a reaction to that phenomena from the right, and on the left, you have Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, but also in countries like Greece and Spain, which are countries that we've been talking about recently, where they have austerity, and you have similar figures emerging there, both again on the right and on the left. These are sort of popular, some people call them populist. I'm not sure about that term, but it's a term that a lot of people use, so we might as well use it. Populist parties that are trying to re-democratize the political process, the government process, to give people a sense that they have a greater say. So the Syriza party in Greece, which we'll be talking about today, is huge in this respect, and the Podemos party in Spain, which we won't be talking about today, but is very, very important all the same. They're all slightly different, but they're all very significant then in terms of testing Mayer's hypothesis about the death of the political party and where austerity lies in terms of that, right? Because I think possibly austerity is the rock that has broken the back of neoliberal technocratic rationality. And the question now is, given that everybody knows that neoliberalism is anti-democratic, after seeing so much austerity and poverty and pain imposed on the people, they are now sort of looking for revenge. And the question is, which way are they going to go? Are they going to go with this kind of hateful, conservative, reactionary, alt-right? I mean, we're not just talking ordinary conservatives here. We're talking like basically, either fascist or borderline fascist policy preferences. That's what the right is offering now under Trump and people like that. He's not your ordinary Ronald Reagan conservative. And conversely, then if that's not to happen, then the left has a job to do, which is to show people that the path to hatred doesn't have to be the path that we follow. We can follow a different path, but that's going to take some work because a lot of people still associate the left with the neoliberals. And in fact, while they are very, very different, it's going to take some time, I think, to repair that reputation because, most Americans think of the Democratic Party as the left, which, I mean, if you look at Hillary Clinton's record, it's just not true. Hillary Clinton is a center-right neoliberal. So let's move on. We want to talk about our topic for this week. And I think the best place to start that is the topic of Brexit. So we bring ourselves to Greece, and we have a sort of a query, I suppose, about what happened there, and that's fair enough. Maybe we don't all know what the background is. So let me take some time to outline that for you. We have in this class already had a little case study on Ireland, and so we know that the Irish government ended up having to nationalise some of its corrupt banks that had taken too many risks, and the Greeks, for their part, had a similar crisis. But now, whereas the Irish government was kind of intervening in a crisis territory that was caused by too much lending to private citizens, the Greeks had a slightly different problem as far as it was still a national debt issue at the end of the day, but it started off as being about the government itself lying about the true nature of the national debt. And controversially, it turned out that the Wall Street investment bank Goldman Sachs had been helping the Greek government disguise its national debt using a financial technique called derivatives. And this was a way basically of kind of using kind of futures trading to leverage money for the Greek government that it would have to pay back at some point, of course, but it didn't count as debt per se. Very, very strange. But Greece and all other countries in the European Union since 1999 under the Maastricht Treaty are supposed to follow pretty strict rules, which levy fines on members of the Eurozone who have exceeded the budgetary deficit, which is currently limited at 3% of gross domestic product. So that means that per year, your government shouldn't be spending money over and above 3% of GDP. And that's in order to try to keep a restriction on debt so that it doesn't get too much out of control. And that's important for every state to do that, according to the planners anyway, because how else are you going to run a single currency? We've talked before about the lack of a tax and transfer system. So there's obviously a temptation for the states to borrow in order to generate fiscal stimulus, especially in times of recession. And what the European Union has set out since 1999 is that that's not really allowed. Total government debt is not supposed to exceed 60% of GDP, notwithstanding the budget deficit. So there's definitely, limits in terms of what governments can borrow. Now, in the Greek situation, the truth is that the deficit each year was much, much greater than the 3% limit. In 2009, in fact, 10 years after Maastricht, it exploded to over 12%. And the Greek government specifically, not the Greek people, because of course they weren't really aware of the situation, but the Greek government had been hiding massive amounts of debts off its balance sheets. Specifically, these were debts accumulated from military expenditure and also healthcare costs. But this only got revealed in 2010 after a European agency called Eurostat did a deep investigation of the Greek government's books. And the revelations shocked the Greek political system. The elections of October 2009 produced a landslide shift in favor of a party called PASOK, which was a slightly left-wing social democratic party, kind of like the British Labour Party, or maybe a little bit like the US Democrats. They came away from that election with 43.92% of the popular vote. This revelation put them in power, but austerity, which was mandated in order to get a bailout from the European Union. Remember, the Irish government was going through the same thing at the same time, right? In order to get money to be able to keep the economy ticking over, you'd have to borrow that from basically from the European Union, because the private markets looked at you as bankrupt, so they weren't going to lend you anything. So PASOK, again, this sort of leftist party, was basically put in the driver's seat, and even though they were left-wing, they had to oversee this austerity. And it there's an interesting term that gets used here called PASOKification. It's kind of a new political science term that's used by some people, but it's very interesting in relationship to Peter Mayer's arguments, because while PASOK were nominally leftist, they kind of fulfilled Mayer's prediction, like the Irish Labour Party, like the British Labour Party before Corbyn. They were making no real effort to negotiate a better deal with the Troika. They weren't going to fight austerity. So in 2012 then, when PASOK had to sign off on the European Union's bailout conditions, they basically didn't fight the European Union at all. So it was a kind of a decision that was political suicide for them, because they were ignoring the base of they were ignoring the motivations of the people who voted them into Parliament in the first place. So in May 2012, you have an election that shows PASOK getting kind of slaughtered. There was no overall winner. And so, a month later, clearly the country's normal pace of events is disrupted, because, no party came away with it as a winner. And then they had to have another election in June of the same year, in 2012. And still none of the parties got to the minimum threshold needed for an overall majority. So it was clear that a coalition would have to be formed. So the biggest party on the bloc was a party called New Democracy, which got 30% of the votes. And they invited different parties to join them. And the caveat was, however, that whoever joined the coalition would have to respect the existing bailout agreement that Greece had signed and ratified with the Troika in February of 2012. So the government that emerged was a coalition of ND, which is New Democracy, PASOK, whatever's left of it, and another party called DMAR. Now, this all kind of went well as it could be imagined, but PASOK was next then going to experience a stunning collapse because in the 2015 election, a new political party came to the front called Syriza, and it was swept to power on a kind of a landslide of discontent, kind of like the way there was support for Jeremy Corbyn or for Bernie Sanders. Syriza kind of rode an anti-establishment left-wing momentum. Now, the 2015 general election is kind of a tough one to explain because there's some interesting things going on here, but it did leave the Greek voters with a big headache because now that Syriza is going to be in charge, the Greeks themselves have to calculate a kind of a trade-off. Like the Irish case that we looked at a few weeks ago, the European Union was trying to punish Greek citizens for the sins of the elite. And you have to understand, however, that there was a massive anger from the bottom up that was driving the election of Syriza. So from the very far left, parties like Antarisa and others were trying to sort of like argue that even Syriza wasn't left-wing enough, and that really the only thing that Greece could do was leave the European Union, leave the Eurozone, to engage in so-called Brexit, and head off on their own. So now this, of course, is probably something that the Prime Minister of Syriza would be kind of nominally keen on, but he's Prime Minister now of a country that owes all this money, and the European Union is one of the few people around that will give Greece any credit at all. If Greece didn't have the European Union to rely on for credit, what would be its fate outside the European Union, as a bankrupt country? So Tsipras, the Syriza Prime Minister, he refused to listen to those voices from the far left, and instead he felt that an exit was maybe something to be used as a threat, but not something that would be ever sort of seriously used. And some people argue that this is maybe his fatal mistake because the European Union partners knew that he might kind of back off. So he did try to use his electoral victory, and he also tried to use what was called the Ohi referendum in June 2015 as leverage for a better deal in his negotiations with the European Union, the Troika, for a third bailout. So what was this Ohi referendum? Basically, Syriza was trying to put it to the Greek people that they should accept or reject the terms of the bailout. And the hope was that the Greeks would overwhelmingly reject the terms of the bailout. They would reject, in other words, austerity, and that Tsipras could go to the Troika and say, haha, you see, the Greek people have rejected austerity. You guys, what you're doing here is illegitimate. It's time for a democratic conversation about this stuff. And you have read in this class the writings of Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister at the time, who was working with Tsipras. And as Varoufakis documents in that text, they couldn't win at the time. They couldn't convert even the results of this referendum, this democratic referendum, into a deal with the Troika. So what were Tsipras's options? What should he do? His options really were to either take the deal, knowing that it had a tremendous amount of austerity attached to it, and knowing that that's not what his citizens wanted, or leave the euro. So what did he do? He decided to take the deal. Now, there were major Greek economists like Lapavitsas at the time who were really arguing very strongly to leave the euro, and they had very good arguments about leaving the euro. They basically argued that the euro was a prison. It had become worse now than a form of slavery. It was a form of national slavery. But as Tsipras argued, to exit the euro under such a debt, it was not clear that the nation would survive. It might even make things worse. So it wasn't so much a desire to disagree with Lapavitsas. Lapavitsas' point was just fine. Let me just put on disturb on that. It wasn't so much a desire to disagree with Lapavitsas on the principle of the matter, but it was the practicality. Lapavitsas is probably right that the European Union's euro project has become kind of a straitjacket or a prison more than anything else. But that's not to say that there were options on the table. So there was a Greek, actually, it's a quote for you guys from a Greek political scientist by the name of Gorgouras, who put it at the time that this was a situation where the field of historical action exceeded the theoretical armory. In other words, it didn't really matter what your theories were. This was a brand new situation, totally unprecedented, and there wasn't really much that would be able to be done either way. So politically then, and perhaps most importantly, the fact is that the Greek population seemed to be aware of what Tsipras was saying, and so there was an overwhelming degree of support, including 66% of Syriza supporters. So, in fairness to Peter Mayer, this wasn't a situation where the membership of the political party hated or overwhelmingly rejected what Tsipras was doing. 66% was a very strong amount of support from his own political party for Tsipras to do what he was doing, to pursue the course that he was pursuing, which was to stay in the euro even after signing the terms of the third memorandum. So cruelly, oddly, now you have this situation where in Greece, Syriza itself is being made to implement austerity by the European Union. And I suppose this is where, if we were to think about Mayer's arguments, that it's fair to say the Greek citizens have been given no real choice. They've been made to pay for the sins of their elites. These are not sins of their doing, they're sins of the elites. And I could go even further here. We talked about Greek debt for military equipment. Well, that's true. The Greek government acquired debt that was to do with very significant amounts of military spending. For a small country like Greece, to have the amount of military equipment that it has is strange. But the Greeks are notoriously afraid of the Turks, and there's a lot of military tension between those two countries. Interestingly, though, the Greeks buy their tanks from the Germans, and so a significant amount of Greece's national debt is debt that the Greek government had spent on buying tanks from Germany. So, this is a point that maybe Germans need to think about, because they're the ones, and Angela Merkel is one of the ones telling Greece that it has been an irresponsible country. But the Germans were only too happy to lend money to the Greeks. German banks were only too happy to lend money to the Greek government to allow Greece to buy German tanks. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, It points yet again to the idea that Europe doesn't have an integrated fiscal structure. It doesn't have tax and transfer. It doesn't have coordinated planning of its military. There's a kind of a problem in the European Union in that sense, that it's trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to act like it's one country, but actually it's still multiple countries. And the powerful institutions and governments of the European Union seem to keep forgetting this. So you might well say, there's definitely some people who do say this, that look, you kind of do have to blame the Greek government at the end of the day, because they elected these guys, and it serves them right. I mean, they must have known something was wrong. You can't hide that amount of money forever. And maybe there's something to that argument. I don't particularly buy it myself because I don't think the evidence is there that the Greek people should have been blamed for what's going on. But even if you do take that position, it still remains the case that if you upset people over and over for long enough and they don't get what they want, even minimally, if the system has no reward for them whatsoever, if they can't get ahead, then they're going to start looking for systems where they feel like they have more opportunities. And so if they don't get what they want from the left-wingers, like the Corbyns or the Tsiprases or the Sanderses, then what happens next, right? And so this is something we got to really look at in Greece, which is the rise of the right. Greece now has an openly neo-Nazi party that can poll about 10% of the vote. So when we think of what the European Union's austerity has meant for Greece and meant for the European Union, we have a party in Greece called Golden Dawn that uses overtly Nazi-esque symbolism on their uniforms and on their insignia, and they're getting 10% of the vote. Now, I don't think they can get past that level, but certainly if it wasn't for the Greek left and it wasn't for the anti-fascist movements in Greece, I think austerity might have driven the Greek people further to the right. So it's very important that in this age of populism, we do our best to forestall the worst case scenario of those two options, which is, that people do go to the right and start to feel that it's okay to say racist things or sexist things, homophobic things, and express, paranoid and malicious views on immigrants.